What if Ferrari's biggest problem at the start of the season was not speed, but its own car? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Because after qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix, something happened that set off all the alarms within the Italian team. Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, ended the session with more questions than answers after discovering that the Ferrari was not reacting as he expected. What seemed like a simple, complicated weekend began to uncover something much more serious: new technical problems that were directly affecting the performance of the car. The most surprising thing is that Hamilton arrived in Australia convinced that the work done with the team would be enough to start the season strong. But as soon as qualifying began, he realized that the reality was very different. The car did not respond the same on the track, the balance constantly changed, and each attempt at a fast lap revealed new difficulties that made it difficult to extract the Ferrari's full potential. And that's where the real problem begins, because when a driver like Hamilton starts to detect errors that not even the team was clear about, it means that something within the project might not be working as it should. The Australian Grand Prix qualifying ended up leaving a very uncomfortable feeling inside the Ferrari garage. What should have been Lewis Hamilton's first big step with the Italian team ended up becoming a weekend full of doubts, hasty adjustments, and worrying signs about the behavior of the car. Since the start of the activity in Albert Park, the team had already noticed that the car was not behaving exactly as they expected, but it was at the key moment in qualifying when those suspicions began to transform into a much more obvious problem. Hamilton, who arrived at this event convinced that he could begin his time with Ferrari competitively, began to discover that adaptation to the car was much more complex than expected, and that the margin to react during a race weekend was much more limited than he had imagined. The 7-time world champion had worked intensely during the pre-season with the team's engineers to understand the behavior of the car, study the simulator data, and prepare different configurations that would maximize performance from the first race of the year. However, when it came time to face the actual qualifying in Melbourne, the situation quickly changed. The Ferrari did not respond in the same way as in the simulations. The balance of the car varied between corners, and Hamilton began to notice that each attempt at a fast lap required constant adjustments that did not always give the expected result. That feeling of unpredictability grew throughout the session to the point that the driver himself began to recognize that he was still very far from completely understanding how to extract the maximum performance from a car. Despite these difficulties, Hamilton tried to react by adapting his driving style to the behavior that the car seemed to need. Instead of insisting on his usual way of attacking the corners, he began to experiment with a technique more similar to that used by his teammate Charles Leclerc, releasing the accelerator earlier than usual and entering the corners with a higher minimum speed to try to stabilize the car and improve cornering. This change in the way of driving was not a coincidence, but a direct response to the sensations he was receiving from the Ferrari during qualifying. The goal was to find a way to compensate for the limitations the car was showing, and although at times it managed to get close to Leclerc's pace, the general feeling was that the car's potential was still very difficult to unlock. The final result ended up reflecting that frustration accumulated during the session. The Ferraris did not manage to get into the positions they expected, and both cars ended up starting from the 4th row of the grid, a situation that contrasted with the expectations that the team had before starting the weekend. For Hamilton, who had arrived in Melbourne with the hope of quickly demonstrating his ability with the new team, this result was an immediate reminder that the adaptation process was going to be longer and more complex than many imagined. The Briton acknowledged after qualifying that he thought he could accelerate his adaptation to the Ferrari thanks to the previous work done with the team, but the experience on the track made it clear to him that there was still a lot to learn and adjust before he could compete at the level he expected. That was the moment when the first internal tensions began to arise, because while the team defended that the performance shown in Australia did not represent the true potential of the car, Hamilton was already identifying signs that indicated that the problem could be deeper. The Ferrari seemed to have speed at times, but accessing that performance was extremely delicate and dependent on a very narrow operating window that wasn't always easy to find during a race weekend. And when a driver of Hamilton's level begins to detect these types of limitations from the first qualifying of the season, a question inevitably arises that begins to worry within the team. If the car is already showing these problems now, what could happen when the real fight for the championship begins? As the minutes passed after qualifying at Albert Park, frustration within the Ferrari entourage slowly began to grow. It was not just a bad position on the grid or a specific result below expectations. What really worried Lewis Hamilton was the feeling that the car was hiding problems that were not yet fully identified by the team. During conversations with his engineers after getting out of the car, the Briton began to detail several situations he had felt during his fast laps, moments in which the car's balance changed without warning, difficulties maintaining stability in certain phases of the corners, and an irregular response from the car when trying to push the limit in qualifying. These details, which for any pilot would already be a warning sign for a world champion with Hamilton's experience, were clear indications that the SF26 was not yet completely under control. Hamilton himself began to explain that the biggest problem was not simply the lack of pure pace, but how difficult it was to access that performance when they really needed it. In Formula One, a competitive car must allow its drivers to repeat fast laps with confidence, knowing exactly how it will react to each corner. But in Australia, that trust didn't quite exist. Each fast lap attempt felt slightly different from the last, forcing the driver to constantly improvise while fighting the stopwatch. That inconsistency was one of the points that bothered the Brit the most, because it meant that the Ferrari could have potential, but unlocking it depended on getting it right with an extremely narrow window of operation. Added to this scenario was another factor that began to generate discomfort within the team: the direct comparison with Charles Leclerc. Although Hamilton managed to get close to the Monegasque's pace at some points in qualifying, it was clear that Leclerc still had a better understanding of the car's behavior in extreme situations. This was not necessarily a surprise, since the Monegasque driver had been working with Ferrari for years and knew the particularities of the car better. However, for Hamilton, having to modify his driving style to adapt to the car was a clear sign that he was still far from feeling completely comfortable with the SF26. Even he himself admitted that he expected the adaptation to be faster, something that ultimately did not happen during the first big weekend of the season. Meanwhile, within Ferrari, the official position tried to convey calm. The team insisted that the result in Australia did not represent the true level of the car, and that several factors from the weekend had affected the overall performance. But behind that optimistic speech, the technical conversations revealed another reality. The car seemed extremely sensitive to small configuration changes, to the evolution of the track, and even to the driver's driving style. That sensitivity made finding the perfect balance a difficult task, especially during a weekend where time to make adjustments is very limited. For Hamilton, all this began to generate a mixture of frustration and concern. Not because he doubted the potential of the Ferrari project, but because he understood perfectly what it meant to face a car with such a delicate performance window. In modern Formula One, where every millisecond counts, any small inconsistency can mean the difference between fighting for pole position or being stuck in the middle of the grid. And if this problem appears already in the first classification of the season, the implications for the rest of the championship could be much more serious than it seems. Thus, what began as a complicated classification began to become something deeper, the beginning of an internal debate within Ferrari about whether the SF26 was really ready to compete at the highest level from the beginning of the championship. And while the engineers analyzed data and telemetries trying to find answers, Hamilton already had a clear feeling in his head. The real challenge of his time with Ferrari was not going to just be winning races, but first fully understanding a car that still kept too many secrets. Qualifying had ended. The data was beginning to be downloaded to the computers in the garage, and the atmosphere inside Ferrari was no longer the same as at the beginning of the weekend. What should have been the beginning of an exciting new stage for Lewis Hamilton had become a first warning of how complicated the road could be. While the engineers analyzed telemetry and compared laps with Charles Leclerc, the Briton began to understand that the real problem was not only in the Australian classification, but in what that result revealed about the behavior of the car. It wasn't simply a matter of finding a few tenths in the setup. The SF26 seemed to require extreme precision to function properly, and when that precision didn't appear, performance dropped all too obviously. Hamilton knew that these types of situations can set the course of an entire season. In Formula One, championships are not lost for a single weekend, but they can begin to slip away when technical problems appear too soon and require several races to solve. Therefore, while the team tried to maintain a calm public discourse, assuring that the car's potential was greater than what it had shown in Melbourne, a much deeper discussion arose inside the garage, whether the Ferrari needed important changes to extend its operating window, or if the problem was in how they were exploiting the current package. The difference between one thing and the other could mean weeks of work in the simulator, urgent updates, or even a rethinking of the car's development. For now, the only thing that is clear is that Lewis Hamilton has already had his first real contact with the difficulties of this new chapter in his career. A chapter that began with enthusiasm, That left some alarm signals in Australia, and that will now depend entirely on how Ferrari responds to one of the biggest technical challenges it faces at the start of the season. I recommend that you expand on the first block because there you can go much deeper into the previous context of the weekend in Australia, the expectations that Ferrari had before qualifying, and how those expectations directly influenced the frustration that Hamilton showed after discovering the first problems with the SF26. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.